When you look out over the ocean, you don't often think about what's under the surface. But all over the world, there are millions of miles of fiber optic cables crisscrossing the ocean floor. They're not much larger than a garden hose, but they're responsible for transmitting up to 95% of global internet traffic.
Fiber optic cables, cables across the ocean are not new. We've had them since the mid-1800s, different forms, copper. But over the years, as data has become more and more important, as we become a more digital, globalized world, more and more data flows under the sea.
As of 2022, there are approximately 530 active submarine cables running all over the globe. In addition to transmitting texts and emails, they also send confidential information like financial transactions and government communications. Without this tech pipeline, the internet wouldn't function, and our digitally driven societies would grind to a halt. Nadia Schadlow, a former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, says protecting these cables and their data needs to become more of a priority.
Anytime an economy is so dependent on infrastructure or a particular sector, it becomes strategic, right? It becomes a point of vulnerability. So our adversaries and competitors recognize this.
U.S. adversaries also recognize the cables themselves are incredibly vulnerable.
Many people will be aware that the actual fiber optic is about the diameter of a human hair. So there might be a couple of dozen fibers inside a cable, but most of the cable is basically to protect the fiber, which is made out of glass. So it's very, very fragile.
While direct sabotage could easily result in damage or destruction, Gavin Tully, an engineer and partner at a firm specializing in subsea cables, says this internet infrastructure is also at risk from fishing trawlers or even natural disasters.
About 10 months ago, there was a massive volcanic eruption in Tonga, and that eruption created a lot of earthquakes and mudslides that cut all the cables to Tonga. So Tonga was basically without communication for weeks because the ash cloud also blocked the backup satellite.
In October, cable damage near the Shetland Islands north of Scotland led to suspicion that an adversary might be trying to make sabotage look like an accident. That's because a Russian research vessel designed to survey the sea floor was reportedly in the area at the time. And it wouldn't be the first instance of an enemy severing a country's communications.
During World War I, England cut all of Germany's subsea cables, which were telegraph cables at the time, of course, some 100+ years ago.
Russia's war against Ukraine and this summer's Nord Stream pipeline incident served as a wake-up call for many of our allies. France proposed spending more than €3 million for ocean floor defense in its 2023 budget. Italy and the UK are also reportedly working to increase surveillance of their underwater cables. And Taiwan is now taking protective measures to ensure communications to the island aren't knocked out by a natural disaster or conflict with China. Here in the U.S., meanwhile, experts are concerned the government isn't doing enough.
We need to develop a better public-private approach toward understanding when these cables become under threat, so to share information more effectively. To also probably fund more cable repair ships as well.
Most cables running to and from the United States are owned by either telecom carriers or private companies. Over the past few years, it's been predominantly content providers like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon investing in new lines. Schadlow says while the owners are ultimately responsible for security and repairs, the government should be involved as well, given national security interests. CBN News reached out to Google for information on how they protect their cables. A spokesperson responded that the best protection against disruption is having a variety of redundant network paths. That means they're not reliant on one single cable.
So the idea is basically creating a global mesh of these types of cables so that if one gets damaged or cut, whether it's on purpose for sabotage or accidental or a natural disaster, it doesn't have significant effect on the global economy.
Another vulnerability in our internet infrastructure comes when the data flowing through the undersea cables reaches land. It's at this point where the information is offloaded. The U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence classified the possibility of cyber attacks against cable landing stations as a high risk to national security. Finally, countries like China could use state-owned companies to sabotage parts of these undersea networks. Huawei Marine, for example, has built or repaired almost a quarter of the world's cables. Some experts already worry Beijing could have tasked them with spying on the data coming through.
We need to be able to provide alternatives to countries and companies that look to Huawei Marine for their components. Similar to the situation with 5G, right? We didn't like Huawei controlling that infrastructure.
While conversations are being had in Congress about securing our internet infrastructure, national security experts like Schadlow say no significant action has been taken. Still, the information sent through these cables grows more and more sensitive, becoming more enticing to our adversaries and more vital to protect. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Virginia Beach, Virginia.